What's up? What's up, Sci family? What's happening? It's time to learn how one neuron cell can connect and talk to another neuron cell without ever touching it. And that is called a synapse. So we're going to learn about synapses. So go ahead and title your page Synapses. We'll define synapses. We'll draw a little model of it, and we'll talk about the actual pathway of how our cells take electrical signals, convert them into chemical signals, and so on and so forth. So let's learn about synapses. So a synapse or synapses are just simply the gaps that are between neuron cells. And if you have several cells that make up our brain or our nervous system, they have to be able to communicate to each other so that if you put your hand over a fire, your brain can tell your hand to move because it senses that it is hot there. So in order for these cells to communicate to each other and it not just being one big cell, there's these synapses, which are the gaps between neuron cells, and they use synapses, sending chemicals between synapses in order to communicate with each other. So synapses are going to be any type of gap or junction between a neuron cell and another neuron cell. So from neuron to neuron. Also from a neuron to, let's say, a receptor cell. And receptor cells are ones that basically receive information. So receive info. So it could be like your eye. Because your eye receives information. Or we can also have gaps or junctions between neurons and effector cells, effector cells. So effector cells are going to be the ones that react to info. So maybe that's your muscles that contract to pick something up, or they relax in order to drop something. So if these weird shapes right here that I drew, if each of these are a neuron cell, they wouldn't actually be touching, but you can imagine this being like a neuron cell where this is like the dendrite, and then this part down here would be like the axon. So we have axon down here, we have like the dendrite down here. What happens is that in each of these gaps again are our synapse, and we have another synapse here too, and another synapse here too, because these are all the gaps in between them. So what happens is that a neuron gets an electrical signal and sends it down to the end of the axon terminal, where the electrical signal turns into a chemical signal. So we'll say electrical, chemical. That chemical signal is received by the next neuron, transferred as an electrical signal, converted into a chemical signal, received by the next neuron as a chemical signal and converted into an electrical signal. It then turns it into a chemical signal so it can transfer it to the next neuron, and so on and so forth. Electrical. So it converts an electrical signal into a chemical signal, which can be received by the next neuron to turn into an electrical, into a chemical, into an electrical, into a chemical signal, and so on and so forth. So how does that happen? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. So there are really 5 steps here in terms of how our electrical signal travels down the neuron and turns into a chemical signal. So we would call this the pathway, because it's the path that the signal transfers from one neuron through a synapse, through that gap, to another neuron. So the first thing that happens is we have an electrical signals, or we could say electrical signals travel through the cell membrane of the neuron, travels through that cell membrane to the end of the cell, which we call the axon terminal. So electrical signal travels through the cell membrane to the axon terminal. Now remember that if we have a myelinated sheath or a myelin sheath, it's going to increase the speed of that electrical signal traveling through the cell membrane by up to 100 times. That is crazy. Adding some fat to our axons increases the speed by 100. Wow. Okay, the electrical signal arrives at the axon terminal, and this electrical signal is going to trigger some things we call voltage gated ion channels. And you're like, what the heck is that? Well, essentially what it is, it's a little channel that is remaining closed except when electricity gets to it. Then that channel is going to be pulled apart and it's going to let some ions into our neuron cell. So what happens then is that those ions are going to trigger some vesicles, and vesicles are just little tiny pouches inside the cell. So the ions that enter from the electricity, relaxing those voltage gated ion channels, the ions enter the neuron and trigger these things that we call neurotransmitters. So ions trigger neurotransmitter vesicles, which are just pouches of neurotransmitters, to bind to the cell membrane. Because the neurotransmitters are inside of the neuron, they need to get over to the next neuron. So the neurotransmitter is our chemical signal. So in order to get it over there, those chemicals are inside of a vesicle. The vesicle binds to the cell membrane, and then they kind of get pushed out of the neuron so they can enter the synapse, which is the gap between the neurons. So in step 4 here, our neurotransmitters are released across our synapse. And a fancy word is a synaptic cleft. Sorry, synaptic, because it's a synapse. Neurotransmitters are released across the synaptic cleft, which is just that gap between the neurons. Remember, if I drew a neuron and another neuron here, that would be the synaptic cleft. So those neurotransmitters, or our chemical messengers, are released across the synaptic cleft, and they bind to receptors, because those are going to receive that chemical signal on the dendrite. Remember, the dendrite is this part down here that has the little projections on it that are going to receive neurotransmitters, and then it travels down to the next neuron. The 5th and final step then is just that those neurotransmitters those chemical messengers, neurotransmitter binding, those binding triggers an electrical response. So we go from electrical at the beginning, chemical once neurotransmitters are involved, back to electrical at the end. So I was talking about neurotransmitters a bunch, so let's just define those. Those are just basically our chemical messengers. So that's electricity gets converted into this chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter, and they will either do one of two things. They will either trigger a response, or they will prevent a response. All right, so neurotransmitters are going to be what cause us to respond or prevent us from responding. So if we look at this, here's someone else's model of what's happening as we can envision that this is a neuron that has its dendrite down here with the soma, the cell body here, and the nucleus, and all those receptors here in the dendrite. The electrical signal travels down the cell membrane. This would be our voltage-gated ion channel. It opens up, and this is the ion, a calcium ion. These all enter, which then cause these vesicles of neurotransmitters to say, hey, let's get out of here. They go and they bind to the cell membrane, they open up, and then all these little blue things here are the neurotransmitters. Those travel across this gap. Remember, the gap is called a synapse or a synaptic cleft. and they then enter they enter these receptor cells, which this is our next neuron. This would be the dendrite of the next neuron, and then those send an electrical signal down to the next end of the axon, and this process repeats itself over and over and over again. So what you need to do is go grab out of the extra spin, go grab one of these pieces of paper, these extra pieces of paper that you're going to tape into your science notebook, because this is going to be your visual. To see that, what happens here is we have an electrical signal that starts. We have an electrical signal which travels down into the end of our axon, which turns into a chemical signal. Those neurotransmitters go across the cleft. There's our synapse, which is the gap between, and then it is a chemical signal that gets received by the next one, and then it travels on down. So these numbers don't match up exactly with the one above, but the main thing I want you to do is to make sure that you highlight or bring attention to the fact that the synapse is the gap between, and this is a process that starts by, you have a sending neuron sending an electrical signal, turns into a chemical signal. We have a receiving neuron that would turn that from an electrical signal into a chemical signal when it passes the neurotransmitters on to the next neuron cell. So that's a synapse. Boom. And it happens so fast. Millions just occurred as you watched, listened, and wrote your science notebook page. If that doesn't blow your mind, good, because you're going to need it as you move forward.